She was freezing to death in the Wyoming blizzard with her newborn infant until a Shoshone hunter found them buried in snow and carried them to his hidden winter lodge, not knowing that saving them would awaken an ancient prophecy and put his entire people in mortal danger. The wind howled like the voices of 10,000 spirits across the endless white expanse of the Wyoming Territory. February 1868 had brought the worst winter storms in living memory, and Lydia May Coulter knew with terrifying certainty that she was going to die in this frozen wasteland.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Her 3-month-old son William lay pressed against her chest beneath layers of torn fabric and her husband's old cavalry coat, his tiny lips blue with cold. Despite her desperate attempts to keep him warm, Lydia's legs had stopped working an hour ago. Maybe 2 hours' time had become meaningless in the swirling white chaos that surrounded her. She stumbled forward through snow that came up to her thighs, each step a monumental effort that sent shooting pains up her spine. Her feet had gone numb inside her worn leather boots, and she could no longer feel her fingers despite keeping them pressed against William's small body. Behind her, somewhere in the storm, lay the smoking ruins of Fort Bridger Station, a trading post and military outpost where her late husband, Sergeant Thomas Coulter, had been stationed before his death, 6 months earlier fighting Cheyenne raiders near the Powder River. The fort had been her sanctuary, her home, the place where she'd given birth to William and tried to build some semblance of a normal life on the frontier. Now it was nothing but charred timber and frozen corpses, destroyed by a war party of Lakota warriors who had swept down from the north like a winter storm. Made flesh. Lydia had escaped only because she'd been in the root cellar when the attack began, gathering preserved vegetables for the evening meal. She'd heard the war cries, the gunshots, the screams of her friends and neighbors being cut down in the compound above. By the time she'd climbed the wooden steps with William in her arms, the fort was already lost. Buildings burned like torches against the gray sky, and painted warriors moved through the smoke like demons from her worst nightmares. She'd run into the forest without thinking, driven by the primal instinct to protect her child. But the storm had been building all day, and within an hour of fleeing the fort, she'd become completely lost in a landscape that looked the same in every direction. Endless white trees, endless white ground, endless white sky that seemed to press down on her like a burial shroud. Now, after wandering for what felt like eternity, Lydia could barely remember why she was still walking. Her mind had begun to play tricks on her. She heard Thomas calling her name through the wind, saw phantom figures moving between the snow-laden pine trees, felt certain that the next ridge would reveal a warm cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. But there was nothing. Nothing but cold and white, and the terrible certainty that she was going to fail in the one thing that mattered most: keeping her son alive. William had stopped crying an hour ago, and that terrified her more than anything. His little body felt too still against her chest, his breathing too shallow. She'd tried to sing to him, tried to keep him alert with gentle bouncing and soft words, but her voice had grown hoarse and her strength was nearly gone. The baby was dying, and she was powerless to stop it. Lydia stumbled again, this time falling hard to her knees in the deep snow. The impact sent a shock of pain through her body, but worse was the way William barely stirred at the sudden movement. She pulled back the edge of the cavalry coat and looked down at his tiny face. His skin was pale as the snow around them, his lips tinged with an ominous blue that made her heart clench with despair. "Please, God," she whispered through chattering teeth, "please don't take him. Take me instead. I don't care what happens to me, but please let my baby live." The wind answered her prayer with a howl that seemed to mock her desperation. Snow swirled around them in spirals that looked almost alive, as if the storm itself was a living thing that had come to claim them. Lydia tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't support her weight anymore. She fell forward, catching herself on Her hands, William pressed safely between her body and the ground. That's when she saw the blood. Red drops in the pristine white snow, leading away through the trees like a trail of breadcrumbs. At first, her mind couldn't process what she was seeing. Blood meant life. Blood meant something warm and alive had passed this way recently. But blood could also mean predators, wounded animals, violence that might be worse than freezing to death. Lydia didn't care. Any chance was better than certain death. She forced herself to her feet one more time and began following the crimson trail. Each step was agony, but the blood drops gave her something to focus on besides the cold and the fear. The trail led deeper into the forest, winding between massive pine trees whose branches hung heavy with snow. As she walked, she began to notice other signs: hoofprints in the snow, broken branches, the clear path of something large moving through the wilderness. The blood trail led upward, following a ridge that seemed to stretch on forever. Lydia's lungs burned as she climbed, and more than once she had to stop and lean against a tree to keep from collapsing. But the trail was fresh, and she could swear the blood drops were getting larger, more frequent. Whatever had left this trail was badly injured and couldn't be far ahead. As she crested the ridge, Lydia saw something that made her gasp. Below, in a small valley sheltered by tall pines, stood a structure unlike anything she'd ever seen on the frontier. It wasn't the rough log cabin she'd expected, but something more elegant and purposeful. The walls seemed to be made of carefully arranged stones fitted together without mortar, and the roof was covered with sod and branches that made it blend perfectly into the landscape. Smoke rose from a hidden chimney, and warm yellow light glowed through windows covered with what looked like scraped hide. But it was what she saw in the small clearing in front of the structure that made her heart race with a mixture of hope and terror. A massive elk lay on its side in the snow, its antlers spanning at least 6 feet across. The animal was clearly dead, but the blood around it was still bright red, steaming in the cold air. And kneeling beside the elk, working with calm efficiency to field dress the carcass, was a man unlike any Lydia had ever seen. He was tall and powerfully built, with long black hair that hung loose around his shoulders. His skin was the deep bronze of someone who spent his life outdoors, and his clothing was a mixture of traditional native dress and frontier practicality: buckskin pants and shirt decorated with intricate beadwork, tall moccasins wrapped with strips of fur, and a heavy buffalo robe thrown over his shoulders. He worked with stone tools and a steel knife, his movements precise and respectful as he prepared the elk for butchering. Lydia knew immediately that this was a Shoshone warrior. She'd heard stories about the tribe from the soldiers at Fort Bridger Station, how they were skilled hunters and horsemen, how they'd been both allies and enemies to different white settlements depending on the season and the politics of treaty making. Some said they were peaceful traders who preferred to avoid conflict. Others claimed they were fierce fighters who showed no mercy to their enemies. Standing there at the edge of the clearing with her dying baby in her arms, Lydia didn't care which stories were true. This man represented the only chance she and William had of surviving the night. But as she stepped forward into the clearing, her exhausted legs finally gave out completely. She pitched forward into the snow, instinctively turning her body to protect William from the impact. The movement caught the hunter's attention, and he looked up from his work to see a white woman collapsing 20 yards away. For a moment that felt like an eternity, they stared at each other across the blood-stained snow. Lydia could see the surprise in his dark eyes, followed quickly by something she couldn't quite read: calculation, perhaps, or wariness. She tried to speak, to call out for help, but her voice came out as nothing more than a croak. The hunter, she could see now that he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with a face that was both handsome and severe, rose slowly to his feet.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
He was even taller than she'd realized, standing well over 6 feet. and the way he moved suggested the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness. He approached her cautiously, his hand resting on the bone handle of a knife at his belt. When he was close enough to see William clearly, his expression changed completely. Whatever wariness had been in his eyes was replaced by something deeper: concern, perhaps even alarm. Lydia managed to pull back the edge of the cavalry coat, revealing William's pale, still face. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "My baby ... The hunter's response was immediate and decisive. He dropped to his knees beside them, his large hands moving with surprising gentleness as he examined William. Lydia felt a shock of warmth as his fingers briefly touched her arm, the first truly warm touch she'd felt in hours. He spoke then, but not in English. The words were liquid and musical, unlike any language Lydia had ever heard. She thought it might be Shoshone, but there were inflections and tones that seemed older somehow, as if he was speaking in a dialect that predated the arrival of white settlers. When she didn't respond, he switched to accented but clear English. "The child is very cold, dangerously cold. You both are." His voice was deep and resonant, with a quality that seemed to calm the wind itself. Lydia felt tears freeze on her cheeks. As relief flooded through her, he was going to help them. This stranger, this Shoshone hunter who had every reason to distrust or even hate white settlers, was going to help them. "I'm Lydia," she managed to say, "Lydia Coulter. This is William. Please, I know you have no reason to trust me, but my baby is dying." The hunter nodded once, a sharp movement that seemed to settle something in his mind. "I am Ayana Vavoka," he said. "In your language, this means eternal flower that walks with spirits, but you may call me Ayana." He stood, and in one fluid motion lifted both Lydia and William from the snow. His strength was remarkable. Lydia wasn't a small woman, and with William and their few belongings, she knew she was no light burden. But Ayana carried them as easily as he might carry a deer, his long strides eating up the distance to the strange stone-dwelling dot. As they approached the structure, Lydia could see that it was even more impressive up close. The stones had been fitted together with incredible precision, and the design seemed to follow the natural contours of the land. It looked ancient and permanent, as if it had grown from the earth itself rather than being built by human hands. Ayana pushed aside a heavy hide curtain that served as a door, and Lydia gasped at the wave of warm air that enveloped them. The interior of the dwelling was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a high ceiling supported by curved wooden beams. A fire burned in a central hearth, its smoke drawn up through an ingenious system of vents that kept the air clear while maintaining the warmth. The walls were covered with carefully arranged furs and woven blankets in patterns that seemed to tell stories. Shelves carved directly into the stone held an array of objects: tools, ceremonial items, bundles of dried herbs, and what looked like books wrapped in oiled leather. The floor was covered with thick buffalo robes that made the entire space feel like a warm nest, but it was the sense of permanence that struck Lydia most powerfully. This wasn't a temporary shelter or even a seasonal camp. This was a home, carefully planned and lovingly maintained. Someone had spent years, perhaps decades, creating this sanctuary in the wilderness. Ayana carried them to a pile of furs near the fire and gently set Lydia down. Her relief at the warmth was so intense it was almost painful. Her frozen hands and feet began to tingle as circulation returned, and she had to bite back a cry as feeling flooded back into her extremities. "The child first," Ayana said, his hands already moving to unwrap William from the cavalry coat. "Hypothermia kills the young quickly." Lydia watched in amazement as the Shoshone hunter worked with the skill of someone who understood both medicine and magic. He stripped William of his wet clothing with gentle efficiency, then wrapped him in soft rabbit fur that seemed to radiate warmth. From a pouch at his belt, He produced what looked like dried leaves and berries, which he crushed between his palms and mixed with warm water from a pot hanging over the fire. "What is that?" Lydia asked, her voice still weak but growing. "Stronger. Medicine," Ayanna replied simply. "Plants that warm the body from within. Very old knowledge, passed down from the time when my people first learned to survive the winter spirits." He tilted William's head back and carefully dripped the herbal mixture into the baby's mouth. To Lydia's amazement, William swallowed reflexively, then made a small sound, the first sound she'd heard from him in hours. "He lives," Ayanna said with satisfaction. "The spirit has not yet chosen to take him to the sky. But he must be kept warm and given this medicine every hour until the sun returns." Lydia felt tears streaming down her face, tears of relief, gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite name. This stranger had done more for her child in 10 minutes than she'd been able to do in hours of desperate wandering. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to thank you enough." Ayanna looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "You do not need to thank me for doing what is right. No child should die in the cold when there is warmth to be shared." He turned his attention to Lydia then, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. His hands moved over her with the same gentle efficiency he'd shown with William, checking for signs of frostbite and hypothermia. His touch was completely professional, but there was something about the way he looked at her, a depth of attention that made her feel as if he was seeing more than just her physical condition. "You are strong," he said finally. "Stronger than you know. Many would have died long before they found this place." "I had to keep going," Lydia said simply, "for William." Something shifted in Ayanna's expression, a flicker of what might have been recognition or understanding. "Yes," he said quietly, "for the child, I understand this." He rose and began moving around the dwelling with purposeful efficiency, gathering supplies and preparing what looked like a meal. Lydia watched him work, marveling at the way he seemed to know exactly where everything was, how every motion was economical and precise. This was a man who had spent years alone, who had learned to take care of himself and his environment with the kind of skill that only came from absolute necessity. But there was something else about him, something that went beyond mere survival skills. The way he'd looked at William, the tenderness in his hands as he'd cared for the baby, the immediate decision to help them despite the obvious dangers, all of it suggested a man who understood loss, who knew what it meant to protect something. Precious Dot, as the warmth of the fire seeped into her bones, and William began to show more signs of life, Lydia felt herself beginning to believe that they might actually survive this nightmare. But even as relief flooded through her, she couldn't shake the feeling that their arrival here was more than just chance. There was something about Ayanna's reaction when he'd seen William, something about the way he'd spoken of old knowledge and ancient spirits that suggested their meeting was part of something larger. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, but inside the stone dwelling, 3 souls who had been strangers an hour ago began the delicate process of learning to trust each other. And in the shadows cast by the flickering firelight, ancient prophecies stirred to life, waiting to be fulfilled in ways none of them could yet imagine. The first thing Lydia noticed when she woke was the silence. After days of howling wind and driving snow, the complete absence of storm sounds felt almost unnatural. Pale morning light filtered through the hide-covered windows of Ayanna's dwelling, casting everything in a golden glow that made the previous night feel like a fever dream, but the warmth against her chest was real. William lay sleeping peacefully. In her arms, his color restored to a healthy pink, his breathing deep and steady. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Less than 12 hours ago, she'd been certain he was dying. Now he looked like any normal, healthy baby, perhaps even healthier than he'd been before their ordeal. Lydia turned her head carefully, not wanting to disturb William, and found Ayanna sitting cross-legged beside the fire. He was working on something with his hands, carving, she realized. watching the precise movements of a bone knife against what looked like a piece of elk antler. His long black hair fell forward to frame his face as he worked, and in the morning light, she could see details that had been hidden by darkness and desperation. The night before, his features were striking high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and those dark eyes that seemed to hold depth she couldn't fathom. But it was his hands that captured her attention. They were large and clearly powerful, with calluses that spoke of years working with tools and weapons, yet they moved with the delicate precision of an artist. Whatever he was carving was taking shape under his guidance with remarkable skill. "You're awake," he said without looking up from his work. "Good. The child has been asking for you." Lydia blinked in surprise. "Asking for me? He's only 3 months old. He can't, not with words," Ayanna interrupted gently, his eyes still focused on his carving. "But children speak in many ways. His spirit has been restless, calling for his mother's touch." As if summoned by their conversation, William stirred against her chest and opened his eyes. They were the same clear blue they'd always been, but there was something different about them now. An alertness, an awareness that seemed far beyond his months. When he looked at her, Lydia felt as if he was really seeing her, recognizing her in a way that sent a shiver down her spine. "There's something different about him," she said, unable to keep the concern from her voice. For the first time since she'd awakened, Ayanna looked directly at her. His expression was serious, almost grave. "Yes, there is." He set aside his carving and moved closer to them, his movements fluid and purposeful. When he was near enough to study William's face, he nodded as if confirming something he'd already suspected. "Last night when I gave him the warming medicine, I noticed certain signs. The way the firelight reflected in his eyes, the pattern of his breathing, the way he responded to the old words I spoke over him." Ayanna paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "These are the marks of one who has been touched by the spirit world." Lydia felt her heart begin to race. "What does that mean?" Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes moving between her face and William's. Finally, he reached for a leather pouch that hung from his belt and withdrew something that Lydia gasped at. It was a piece of turquoise, but unlike any stone she'd ever seen. The blue-green surface seemed to shift and swirl as if it contained liquid light, and when Ayanna held it near William, the baby's eyes tracked its movement with an intensity that was almost unsettling. "This stone has been in my family for 7 generations, Ayanna said, his voice taking on a formal, ceremonial quality. "It was given to my ancestor Tagi the Dreamer by a white buffalo that spoke to him in visions. The stone only responds to those who carry the blood of prophecy." He held the turquoise closer to William, and Lydia watched in amazement as the stone began to glow with a soft pulsing light. William reached toward it with tiny fingers, making soft cooing sounds that almost seemed like words. "I don't understand," Lydia whispered, though part of her was beginning to suspect she understood all too well. Ayanna carefully returned the stone to its pouch and sat back on his heels. "There is an old prophecy among my people. It speaks of a time when the white and red worlds would collide, when the old ways would be threatened and the people would face a choice between survival and destruction." He looked directly into Lydia's eyes, and she felt the weight of something immense settling between them. "The prophecy tells of a child born between worlds, red blood and white blood flowing together in one small body. This child would be marked by the spirits, blessed with the ability to speak to both peoples, to bridge the gap between enemy tribes." Ayanna's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "This child would either bring peace to the warring nations or herald the end of all things." Lydia stared at him, her mind reeling. "You think William is this child? But that's impossible. He's not. I mean, his father was Thomas Coulter, a cavalry sergeant. We're both white." Ayanna's expression grew even more serious. "Are you certain of this?" The question hit Lydia like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to respond with an emphatic yes, then stopped as memories came flooding back, memories she'd tried to bury, to forget. Thomas had been away on patrol for nearly 2 months before William was conceived. She'd been alone at Fort Bridger Station, lonely and frightened, struggling with the isolation and danger of frontier life. And there had been that night in late spring when she'd encountered the Shoshone trader who'd come to the fort with furs and information about safe passage through the mountains. His name had been Joseph Crowfeather, and he'd been unlike any native man she'd ever met. Educated at a mission school, he spoke perfect English and carried himself with a dignity that had impressed even the most prejudiced soldiers at the fort. He'd stayed for 3 days, sleeping in the trader's quarters and sharing meals with the officers and their families. Lydia remembered how he'd looked at her, not with the hunger or contempt she'd grown used to from some of the soldiers, but with genuine interest and respect. They'd talked for hours about books, about the differences between white and native cultures, about the beauty and harshness of the frontier. And on his last night at the fort, there was someone, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Trader. He was ... He was kind to me when Thomas was away. But it was only one night, and I was certain that William was Thomas's son. Ayanna nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already known. Joseph Crowfeather is my cousin. He told me of a white woman at Fort Bridger Station who had touched his heart. He said she was different from other whites, that she listened. When he spoke of the old ways, that she didn't look at him as if he were an animal to be feared or pitied. Lydia felt tears burning her eyes. I cared for him, more than I should have. But I was married, and he was ... It was impossible. Nothing is impossible when the spirits will it, Ayanna said gently. Joseph carries the blood of dreamers and vision seekers. His grandfather was Tagi the Dreamer, the same ancestor who received this sacred stone. If William is indeed his son, then the child carries the bloodline of prophecy. As if responding to his name, William turned his head toward Ayanna and made a sound that was startlingly close to actual speech. Both adults froze, staring at the infant in amazement. Did he just... Lydia began. Yes, Ayanna said, his voice filled with wonder and something that might have been fear. He spoke in the old language. He said grandfather. The implications of this hit Lydia like an avalanche. If William was truly Joseph's son, if he carried this prophetic bloodline, then everything about their situation was far more complex and dangerous than she'd realized. The attack on Fort Bridger Station, their escape into the storm, their arrival at Ayanna's hidden dwelling, none of it was coincidence. What does this mean for us? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Ayanna rose and walked to a shelf carved into the stone wall. He returned with what looked like a bundle of animal hide wrapped around something bulky. When he unfolded it, Lydia saw that it contained dozens of what appeared to be painted pieces of bark, each covered with symbols and figures she didn't recognize. These are the vision pictures of Tagi the Dreamer, Ayanna explained, selecting several pieces and laying them out on the buffalo robe between them. Each one shows a part of the great prophecy. The first image showed 2 figures, one clearly native, one clearly white, standing on opposite sides of a great chasm. Between them was a tiny figure that seemed to glow with inner light. The child of 2 worlds, Ayanna said, pointing to the small figure. Born to bridge the gap between peoples who have forgotten how to trust. The second image was more disturbing. It showed armies of both whites and natives converging on a mountain that seemed to be on fire. In the sky above, dark spirits with wings like ravens circled ominously. But the prophecy also warns of those who would use the child's power for destruction, Ayanna continued. There are forces, both white and native, who believe that war is the only path forward. They would see the child dead rather than allow peace to flourish. The third image made Lydia's blood run cold. It showed a white woman holding a glowing child while surrounded by warriors with painted faces. But these weren't Shoshone warriors. The symbols on their clothing and weapons were different, more angular and aggressive. Lakota, Ayanna said, noting her expression. The same tribe that destroyed your fort. They have their own prophecies. Their own seers who read the signs in different ways. To them, a child of mixed blood represents not hope but contamination, a weakening of the pure warrior spirit that has sustained them through generations of conflict. Lydia looked down at William, who was studying the painted bark with those unnaturally alert eyes. They'll come looking for us, won't they? Yes. The signs were clear when you arrived. The storm that brought you here, the way the sacred stone responded to the child, the fact that you found this place at all when it has been hidden from white eyes for over a century. Ayanna gathered up the vision pictures with careful reverence. The Lakota war chief Bear Claw has shamans who read the same signs. They will know that the prophesied child has been born, and they will not rest until he is destroyed. The weight of this knowledge settled over Lydia like a physical burden. She'd thought their greatest danger was the cold and the isolation of the frontier. Now she realized they were at the center of forces much larger and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. What do we do? She asked. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeking answers in the dancing flames. When? He finally spoke. His voice carried the certainty of someone who had wrestled with difficult decisions and found his path. We prepare. The winter will protect us for now. Even Bear Claw's warriors cannot travel easily in weather like this. But when the spring thaw comes, they will come. And when they do, we must be ready. He looked at her with an intensity that made her feel as if he was seeing straight through to her soul. I will teach you the old ways of survival. How to read the signs of the land. How to move through the wilderness without leaving tracks. How to fight if fighting becomes necessary. You must become more than just a white woman with a baby. You must become a guardian of the prophecy. Lydia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. You're talking about war. I am talking about survival. Not just for you and the child, but for the possibility of peace itself. There are others who believe in the prophecy, both white and native, who would protect the child if they knew of his existence. But there are also those who would kill him without hesitation. Ayanna moved to another shelf and withdrew a bundle wrapped in soft leather. When he unfolded it, Lydia saw weapons, a bow made from horn and sinew, a quiver of arrows with obsidian points, knives of different sizes, and what looked like a war club decorated with eagle feathers. The choice is yours, he said, his dark eyes never leaving her face. You can take the child and leave when the storm passes. Try to reach another white settlement, live a normal life, hope that those who hunt you never find your trail. He paused, letting the weight of that option settle. Or you can stay. Learn the ways that will keep you both alive. Accept that your son's destiny is larger than either of us can fully understand. Help me protect not just his life, but the future he represents. Lydia looked down at William, who was watching their conversation with those impossibly aware eyes. In 3 months of life, he'd already survived more than most people faced in years. And if Ayanna was right, his greatest challenges were still ahead. But as she thought about the alternative, running, hiding, living in constant fear, she realized there was really no choice at all. Whatever William's destiny might be, she would face it with him. And if that meant learning to be something she'd never imagined, then that's what she would do. Teach me, she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was accepting. Teach me everything I need to know. Ayanna nodded, a hint of what might have been approval flickering in his dark eyes. Good, we begin today. But first, there is something else you must understand. He moved to the wall and pressed his hand against what looked like a solid stone. To Lydia's amazement, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a hidden chamber beyond. This dwelling is more than just a winter shelter, Ayanna said, gesturing for her to follow him into the secret room. It is a sanctuary built by my people generations ago to protect the sacred objects and knowledge of our tribe. And now it will protect the most sacred thing of all, the child of prophecy. The hidden chamber was smaller than the main room, but no less impressive. The walls were covered with more vision pictures, but these were painted directly on the stone in colors that seemed to glow with their own light. Shelves held objects that Lydia couldn't begin to identify: ceremonial masks, bundles of herbs, carved figures that seemed to move in the flickering light from oil lamps, set in niches around the room, but it was the center of the room that took her breath away. There, carved directly from the living rock, was a cradle of sorts, a depression in the stone lined with the softest furs and decorated with symbols that seemed to pulse with power. Above it, suspended from the ceiling by nearly invisible threads, hung dozens of objects: crystals, feathers, carved bones, pieces of metal that caught and reflected light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "This is where the child of prophecy was meant to sleep," Ayanna said softly. "My ancestors prepared this place based on visions received over 100 years ago. They knew that one day, the bridge builder would come, and when he did, he would need protection not just from physical enemies, but from spiritual ones as well." Lydia felt goosebumps rise on her arms as she looked at the ancient cradle. "You're saying your people have been waiting for William for over a century? We have been waiting for what William represents. Whether he is truly the one foretold, only time will tell, but the signs." Ayanna trailed off, his eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. "What signs?" "When you arrived last night, the sacred objects in this room began to resonate. The crystals sang, the feathers moved without wind, and the vision stone grew warm against my chest. These things have never happened before, not in all the years I have been guardian of this place." He looked at her with an expression that mixed wonder and responsibility in equal measure. "The spirits have sent you to us, Lydia Coulter. And whether we are ready or not, the time of prophecy has begun." Outside the hidden sanctuary, the wind began to pick up again, and Lydia could hear the first whispers of another storm approaching. But inside the ancient chamber, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom and power of generations, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death, a sense of purpose larger than mere survival. Whatever lay ahead, whatever dangers they would face, she and William were no longer alone. They were part of something ancient and sacred, protected by forces she was only beginning to understand. And with Ayanna as their guide and guardian, they would learn to be worthy of the trust that had been placed in them. The child of prophecy slept peacefully in his mother's arms, while around them the wheels of destiny began to turn. 3 weeks into February, the killing cold that had gripped the Wyoming territory began to show its first signs of breaking. During the day, icicles would drip steadily from the eaves of Ayanna's stone dwelling, and patches of dark earth began to show through the snow in the sheltered spots where the sun lingered longest. But it was the nights that brought the real change, not just in temperature, but in the very quality of the darkness itself. Lydia had learned to read the signs that Ayanna taught her. The way the wind shifted from the brutal north to the gentler west. How the behavior of the few winter birds that remained changed from desperate survival to tentative hope. Most importantly, she'd learned to listen to the subtle sounds that carried across the frozen landscape, sounds that spoke of movement, of life stirring in places where it had been dormant. And lately, those sounds had begun to include things that made her blood run cold. It started with the wolves. For the first 2 weeks, their howling had been the normal communication of pack animals marking territory and calling to their kind. But in recent nights, the howls had taken on a different quality, more urgent, more agitated, as if the wolf packs were being pushed from their usual hunting grounds by something they feared. They sense what comes, Ayanna had told her 3 nights ago as they listened to the distant chorus. Wolves are the brothers of the Lakota. They know when the war bands are moving, even from great distances. Then came the ravens. Lydia had noticed them gathering in unusual numbers, their black forms stark against the white landscape. They would arrive in the early morning, dozens at a time, circling the valley where Ayana's dwelling lay hidden before settling in the tall pines. To watch and wait. Their presence made her skin crawl, especially after Ayana explained their significance. Ravens are the messengers of the spirit world, he'd said, his face grave as he watched the dark birds through the hide-covered window. They gather when great changes are coming, when the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead grows thin. Their numbers tell us that powerful shamans are working medicine somewhere nearby, medicine meant to find what is hidden. But it was the dreams that truly frightened her. They had started a week ago, vivid nightmares that felt more real than waking life. In them, she saw painted warriors moving through the snow like vengeful spirits, their faces marked with symbols she didn't recognize, but that filled her with primal terror. She saw fires burning in the darkness, heard the sound of war drums echoing across frozen valleys, felt the presence of something vast and malevolent searching for her and William with relentless purpose. The worst dream had come. Just 2 nights ago. In it, she stood in a clearing surrounded by warriors whose faces were painted like skulls. At their head was a figure that made her wake screaming, a massive man with scars covering half his face, wearing a headdress made from the skull and fur of an enormous bear. His eyes were the pale blue of winter ice, and when he spoke, his voice was like the grinding of glaciers. "The half-blood child will not see another moon," he had said in the dream, his words somehow understandable despite being spoken in a language she'd never heard. The prophecy dies with him, and the old ways remain pure. When she'd described the dream to Ayana, his face had gone ashen. "Bear Claw," he'd whispered. "You have seen Bear Claw, war chief of the Lakota winter bands. The fact that he appears in your dreams means his shamans have found some trace of you, some spiritual thread they can follow. They are getting closer." Now, as Lydia sat by the fire with William sleeping in her arms, she tried to focus on the lessons Ayana had been teaching her rather than her growing fear. Over the past 3 weeks, he had transformed her from a helpless refugee into something approaching a frontier woman who might actually survive what was coming. The first thing he'd taught her was how to move silently. In the white world, you stomp through the forest like a wounded buffalo, he'd said with characteristic bluntness on her first day of training. Every step announces your presence to everything that lives. Out here, noise equals death. Hour by hour, he'd shown her how to place her feet to avoid breaking twigs, how to use the natural sounds of the forest to mask her movement, how to read the ground for the safest path. It had been humiliating at first. She'd felt clumsy and obvious, stumbling over roots and sending small avalanches of snow cascading from overloaded branches. But gradually, something had begun to change. Her muscles remembered patterns they'd never learned, her senses sharpened to detect subtleties she'd never noticed before. "You have the instincts," Ayana had told her after she'd successfully stalked a deer to within 10 feet without being detected. They were sleeping, but they wake quickly. This is another sign that the child you carry is blessed by the spirits. The physical training had been brutal but necessary. Ayana taught her to use weapons she'd never imagined, holding the war club with its weighted head that could crush a skull, the curved skinning knife that became an extension of her hand, the short bow that required strength she'd had to build day by day. Her hands, soft from her previous life as an officer's wife, became calloused and strong. Her body, weakened by childbirth and frontier hardships, grew lean and quick, but it was the mental training that truly transformed her. Ayana had begun by teaching her to understand the landscape not as a collection of pretty scenery, but as a living entity with moods and messages. Every bend in a stream, every pattern of vegetation, every flight of birds carried information that could mean the difference between life and death. "The land speaks to those who know how to listen," he'd explained, leading her through exercises that seemed almost mystical. Your people see only resources to be taken. Trees to be cut, rivers to be dammed, animals to be killed. But everything is connected. When you learn to see these connections, you begin to understand what the Shoshone call the Great Pattern. She'd learn to read weather signs days in advance, to identify edible plants even in winter, to find water in places that looked bone dry. More importantly, she'd learned to sense the presence of other humans at distances that would have seemed impossible. Before her training, "Close your eyes," Ayanna would say during their practice sessions. "Feel the forest around you. Everything has a spirit, a way of being in the world. When something doesn't belong, the pattern changes. You can feel it if you know how to pay attention." It sounded like mystical nonsense at first, but gradually Lydia began to understand what he meant. There was a rhythm to the wilderness, a harmony of sounds and sensations that flowed like music. When humans entered that space, especially humans with violent intentions, they created discord that could be felt by anyone sensitive enough to notice. The spiritual training had been the most difficult for her to accept. Raised in the rational world of frontier Christianity, Lydia had struggled with concepts that seemed to have no basis in anything she understood as real. But Ayanna's patience and William's continuing development had gradually worn down her resistance. "Watch your son," Ayanna had said during one of their evening conversations. "See how he responds to things that aren't there. He reaches for shadows, laughs at empty air, follows movement that your eyes cannot see. This is not imagination. This is the natural state of all children before they are taught to ignore what they cannot explain." And it was true. William's behavior had become increasingly unusual as the weeks passed. He would stare fixedly at empty corners, as if watching people who weren't there. He would cry inconsolably when certain weather patterns approached, as if sensing danger and atmospheric changes that wouldn't become apparent for hours. Most unsettling of all, he had begun to make sounds that were unmistakably attempts at speech, but speech in a language that neither Lydia nor Ayanna recognized. The old tongue, Ayanna had explained after one particularly clear example. The first language spoken before the tribes separated and developed their own ways of speaking. Only the most powerful shamans remember fragments of it now. That your son speaks it naturally is perhaps the strongest sign yet that he carries the blood of prophecy. But with William's growing abilities came growing danger. The sacred turquoise that Ayanna wore had begun to pulse with increasing frequency, especially at night. The vision pictures in the hidden chamber had started to show new images, dark figures moving across snow-covered landscapes, closing in on their hidden sanctuary with methodical purpose. Most ominously, Ayanna himself had begun to experience the kind of prophetic dreams that had marked his ancestor Tagi the Dreamer. "I see a great battle coming," he'd told Lydia after waking from one such dream, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. Not just between warriors, but between different visions of what the world should become. Those who believe in the prophecy of unity against those who believe only in the purity of separation. He'd gone on to describe visions of white soldiers and Lakota warriors united in their determination to destroy William, seeing him as a threat to their own tribal identities. But he'd also seen allies Shoshone elders who remembered the old prophecies, white traders and settlers who had learned to live in harmony with native peoples. Even members of other tribes who believed that survival in the changing world required adaptation rather than resistance. The time of hiding is almost over, Ayanna had concluded. Soon we will have to choose between flight and fight. And I fear that flight will no longer be possible. That conversation had taken place 3 days ago, and since then the signs of approaching danger had multiplied exponentially. The ravens gathered in ever larger numbers. The wolves had fallen completely silent. Most tellingly, the weather itself seemed to be responding to unseen forces, sudden temperature drops that came without warning, winds that shifted direction. for no apparent reason, and an oppressive atmospheric pressure that made even breathing feel difficult on this particular night. As Lydia sat by the fire trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, she could feel the weight of approaching crisis like a physical presence in the room. William was restless in her arms, making the soft sounds that she'd learned meant he was sensing spiritual disturbances. Outside, the night was unnaturally quiet. Not even the sound of wind in the trees broke the oppressive silence. Ayanna emerged from the hidden chamber, carrying items she'd never seen before, a war shield painted with symbols that seemed to move. In the firelight, a lance tipped with a point that looked like it was made from meteoric iron, and most unnervingly, a mask carved from what appeared to be a human skull and decorated with eagle feathers and bear claws. "Tonight, the enemy shamans make their strongest push to find us," he said, his voice carrying the formal cadence he used when speaking of spiritual matters. "I must enter the spirit world to confuse their vision, to turn their searching magic back on itself, but this is dangerous work. If they are stronger than I am, if they have more warriors lending their power to the search." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Lydia understood that he was risking his life, possibly his soul, to protect them. "What should I do?" she asked. "Guard the child, trust your instincts. And if something goes wrong, if I do not return from the journey I'm about to take, you must be ready to run." Ayanna moved to a corner of the room and began drawing symbols on the floor with what looked like colored sand. "There is a place 2 days' travel to the north where my cousin Joseph, Crow Feather, waits with others who believe in the prophecy. If the worst happens, take William there. They will know what to do." Lydia felt panic rising in her chest. "You're leaving us?" "Not leaving. But where I'm going, physical bodies cannot follow." Ayanna had finished his sand paintings complex, geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "I will be here in body, but my spirit must travel to the places where the enemy shamans work their magic. It is the only way to protect us from their searching." He placed the skull mask over his face, and immediately the entire character of the room changed. The firelight seemed to dim, shadows began moving independently of their sources, and the air itself grew thick with a presence that raised every hair on Lydia's body. When Ayanna spoke again, his voice was completely different, deeper, older, carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats. "Do not speak to me while I am gone, no matter what you see or hear. Do not touch me unless William's life is in immediate danger. And whatever happens, do not look directly into the mask. The spirits I must call are older and more dangerous than anything you can imagine." Lydia nodded, clutching William closer to her chest. The baby had gone completely still, his eyes wide and fixed on the masked figure that no longer looked entirely like the man who had saved them. Ayanna began to chant in the old language, his voice rising and falling in patterns that seemed to resonate in Lydia's bones. The sand paintings on the floor began to glow more brightly, and the shadows in the room started moving in ways that defied any natural source of light. Then, between one heartbeat and the next, everything changed. The walls of the dwelling seemed to dissolve, replaced by a vast landscape under a star-filled sky. Lydia could see through what should have been solid stone to vistas that stretched for impossible distances. And moving across that landscape were figures that made her blood freeze, dozens of painted warriors riding horses that left no tracks. In the snow, led by the massive figure from her nightmares, Bear Claw himself, but more terrifying were the things that flew above the war party, creatures that were part raven, part something else entirely, with eyes that glowed like coals, and voices that sounded like screaming wind. These were the enemy shamans, she realized, transformed into their spirit forms to search for traces of the prophesied child. As she watched in fascination and terror, she saw other figures moving through the spirit landscape, defenders, warriors of light who moved to intercept the dark searchers. At their head was a figure she recognized as Ayanna, but transformed. glowing with power that made him visible across vast distances. The battle that followed was unlike anything from the physical world. Beings of pure energy clashed in explosions of light and darkness that lit up the spirit sky like lightning. The very fabric of reality seemed to bend and twist as forces beyond. Human comprehension struggled for supremacy. And through it all, William watched with those impossibly aware eyes, occasionally making sounds that seemed to guide or strengthen the defenders in their desperate fight. The spiritual battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, with a sound like thunder rolling across infinite distances, the Dark Searchers broke off their attack and fled back toward the north. The spirit landscape faded, the walls of the dwelling solidified, and Ayanna collapsed forward onto the sand paintings, the skull mask rolling away from his face. Lydia rushed to his side, careful not to disturb the still glowing symbols on the floor. His skin was pale and covered with sweat, his breathing shallow and rapid. But when he opened his eyes, she saw triumph there along with exhaustion. "We won," he whispered. "This time we won, but the cost ... He struggled to sit up, wincing, as if in physical pain. "They know our general location now. The spiritual defenses held, but barely. And Bear Claw's shamans are stronger than I expected, much stronger." Lydia helped him move away from the sand paintings, which were already beginning to fade back to ordinary colored dirt. "What does this mean?" "It means we have perhaps a week before they narrow their search enough to find this valley. It means the final confrontation is coming, whether we're ready or not." Ayanna looked at William, who was now sleeping peacefully as if nothing unusual had happened. "And it means that your son's power is growing faster than anyone expected. He helped in the spirit battle tonight, guided my attacks against the enemy shamans. A 3-month-old child should not be capable of such things." Lydia felt a chill that went deeper than winter cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that the prophecy is accelerating. Events that should take years to unfold are happening in weeks. The child of two worlds is not just awakening to his power, he's actively drawing the crisis to himself, forcing the final confrontation between the old ways and the new." Ayanna stood slowly, gathering up the spiritual implements he'd used in the battle. "Which means we have no choice now but to prepare for war. Real war, with real weapons and real consequences. The time for hiding is over." As if in response to his words, a sound echoed across the valley from the north, faint but unmistakable. War drums, beaten in the rhythm that meant death was coming. The final test was about to begin. The morning after the spiritual battle brought visitors that changed everything. Lydia woke to the sound of horses approaching. Through the dawn mist, not the thundering charge of war ponies, but the measured pace of travelers who came in peace. She found Ayanna already awake, standing at the window with his hand resting on his rifle, though his posture suggested caution rather than alarm. "Friends," he said quietly, noting her worried expression, "but friends carrying heavy news." 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their horses picking their way carefully down the slope toward the hidden dwelling. Even from a distance, Lydia could see they were Shoshone, their dress and the way they sat their horses marking them as clearly as any written sign. But these weren't the winter hunters or traders she might have expected. These were people of importance, their clothing rich with beadwork and their weapons bearing the kind of decoration that spoke of high rank. The lead rider was a woman, tall and proud despite her obvious age. Her hair was streaked with silver but hung in long elaborately. Braided plaits decorated with eagle feathers and carved bone ornaments. She wore a dress of white buckskin so finely crafted it seemed to glow in the morning light, and the horse she rode was a magnificent paint stallion that moved with the controlled power of a barely contained storm. Behind her rode 2 men who were clearly warriors despite their peaceful approach. One was older, perhaps 50, with scars marking his arms and face that told of many battles survived. The other was younger, maybe 25, but carried himself with the confidence of someone who had already proven his worth in combat. Both wore the traditional dress of Shoshone fighters' buckskin leggings, shirts decorated with porcupine quills, and wore bonnets that indicated their status as proven veterans. "Sacagawea Winona," Ayanna breathed, and Lydia heard something like awe in his voice. "The grandmother of visions. I did not expect. She has not left the sacred valley in 10 years. Lydia looked at him questioningly, and he explained quickly as the riders approached. "She is the most powerful medicine woman among all the Shoshone bands. It was she who trained my grandfather in the old ways, she who keeps the prophecies alive in our people's memory. If she has come here, it means the spirit battle last night was felt far beyond this valley," the old woman said as she dismounted with surprising grace. Her voice carried clearly across the clearing, rich and resonant despite her age. "It means the enemy shamans were not the only ones watching when the child of prophecy revealed his power." She approached the dwelling with the easy confidence of someone who had every right to be wherever she chose to be. Up close, Lydia could see that the woman's face was a map of wisdom and experience lined with age but sharp with intelligence. That seemed to miss nothing. When her dark eyes settled on Lydia, she felt as if every secret she'd ever harbored was being gently but thoroughly examined. "You are Lydia Coulter," Sacagawea Winona said, not a question but a statement of fact. "The white woman who carries the child between worlds. You look different than I expected from the visions." "Different how?" Lydia asked, unsure whether she should be offended or curious. The old woman smiled, transforming her stern features into something unexpectedly warm. "Stronger, more awake. The woman I saw in the prophecy dreams was asleep to her own power, blind to the spirits that moved around her. But you..." She gestured to the bow slung across Lydia's shoulder, the knife at her belt, the way she instinctively positioned herself to protect William. "You have learned to see with more than your eyes." Ayanna stepped forward, offering the traditional greeting of respect due to an elder of Sacagawea Winona's status. "Grandmother, you honor us with your presence. But I fear the danger you face by coming here is nothing compared to the danger all our people face if we fail to act," the old woman interrupted firmly. "Show me the child, Ayanna. Let me see with my own eyes what has stirred the spirits to such heights of passion." Lydia hesitated for a moment, then carefully pulled back the soft fur that covered William's sleeping face. The baby stirred at the change in light, opening eyes that seemed impossibly blue in the morning sun. When his gaze fell on Sacagawea Winona, something extraordinary happened. William smiled, that it wasn't the random facial expression of an infant, responding to light or sound. It was a deliberate, recognizing smile directed specifically at the old medicine woman. And when he smiled, the sacred turquoise stone hanging around Ayanna's neck began to glow with soft, pulsing light. Sacagawea Winona drew in a sharp breath, her composure shaken for the first time since her arrival. "Great Spirit, preserve us," she whispered. "The prophecies spoke truly. This child knows me, recognizes what I am, even though we have never met. The blood of the ancients runs strong in him." She looked up at Lydia with new respect. "You have been blessed beyond your understanding, white woman. This child will reshape the world, but only if he lives to grow into his power." The older warrior had dismounted and was scanning the tree line with the constant vigilance of someone accustomed to danger. "Grandmother," he said quietly, "we should speak of these matters inside. The ravens watch, and ravens remember everything they see." Indeed, Lydia noticed, the black birds had gathered again in unusual numbers, perching silently in the surrounding pines like dark sentinels. Their presence sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning cold. Inside the dwelling, Sacagawea Winona examined everything with the thoroughness of someone cataloging resources for a coming battle. She studied the hidden chamber with particular interest, running her fingers over the ancient vision pictures and nodding approval at the spiritual defenses Ayanna had maintained. "You have done well, grandson," she told Ayanna. "But the time of hiding is ending faster than any of us anticipated. The enemy moves more quickly than the prophecy suggested." She settled herself by the fire with the dignity of a queen holding court, and the two warriors took positions near the windows where they could watch for approaching threats. Lydia found herself sitting across from the most powerful woman she'd ever met, holding a baby who apparently represented the hope or doom of entire nations. "Tell me what you know of Bear Claw," Sacagawea Winona said without preamble. Ayanna's expression grew grim. "He leads the winter bands of the Lakota, those who believe that compromise with the white world means death to the old ways. His shamans are powerful, and his warriors are said to be without fear or mercy." "All true," the old woman confirmed. "But there's more you do not know. Bear Claw has formed an alliance with elements among your own government white men who share his belief that mixing of the races represents contamination of pure bloodlines." Lydia felt her stomach drop. "What kind of alliance?" "Colonel Marcus Jennings of the Territorial Army has been meeting secretly with Bear Claw's representatives. Jennings believes that the prophecy of a child who could unite the races represents a threat to white dominance in the territories. He has promised Bear Claw weapons and information in exchange for the elimination of what they both see as a mongrel threat to racial purity." The implications hit Lydia like a physical blow. Not only were they being hunted by Lakota warriors, but by elements of her own people's soldiers who should have been protecting settlers, like her, were instead working to ensure her son's death. "How many?" Ayanna asked. "Bear Claw leads perhaps 60 winter warriors, all of them experienced fighters who know this country as well as you do. But Jennings has 3 companies of cavalry, nearly 200 men, and access to artillery that could reduce this entire valley to rubble." Sacagawea Winona paused to let the weight of those numbers settle, then continued. "However, they are not the only forces moving. Word of the child's birth has spread among those who believe in the prophecy of unity. Chief Washakie of the Eastern Shoshone has declared that any harm to the child of two worlds will be considered an act of war against all Shoshone people. He marches with 400 warriors." Lydia felt a surge of hope, quickly tempered by the old woman's next words. "But Washakie's force is still 5 days away, and our enemies are much closer. The spiritual battle you fought last night revealed your location to more than just Bear Claw's shamans. Colonel Jennings' scouts will have triangulated the source of the spiritual disturbance. They will arrive within 2 days, 3 at most." The younger warrior spoke from his position by the window. "Grandmother, there is something else. The ravens bring word from the eastern valleys. Joseph Crowfeather rides toward this place with 20 fighters, but he is being pursued by a larger force of Jennings' cavalry. He may not reach us before the main attack begins." Lydia's heart leaped at the mention of William's father, followed immediately by fear for his safety. "Joseph is coming here?" "He felt the spiritual calling when your son's power was revealed," Sacagawea Winona explained. "The blood connection between father and child created a bond that transcended distance. He knows his son is in danger, and nothing will keep him from trying to protect what he helped create." Ayanna had been studying a map drawn on birch bark, marking positions with small stones. If Jennings' main force comes from the south and Bear Claw attacks from the north, well, Joseph is pinned down to the east. He looked up grimly. "We will be surrounded with no escape route except west into the deepest wilderness." "Which is exactly what I'm counting on," Sacagawea Winona said with a slight smile. "The enemy thinks in terms of conventional warfare: large forces, direct confrontation, overwhelming advantage. But this battle will not be won by numbers alone." She reached into a leather pouch and withdrew an object that made everyone in the room fall silent. It was a crystal unlike anything Lydia had ever seen, clear as water, but shot through with veins of silver and gold that seemed to move of their own accord. When the old woman held it up to the firelight, the crystal began to sing with a sound, like wind through sacred canyons. "This is the heart of the mountain," Sacagawea Winona said reverently. "It was given to the first Shoshone by the Great Spirit himself, when our people were young and the world was different than it is today. It contains power that predates the arrival of all other peoples on this continent, power that can awaken the land itself to defend what is sacred." She looked directly at Lydia, but such power requires sacrifice. It demands that someone willingly offer their life force to awaken the ancient guardians. And once awakened, those guardians will reshape this valley in ways that cannot be undone. Lydia felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter. What kind of guardians? Spirits of stone and storm, beings of wind and fire that were old when the first humans walked this earth. They sleep in the mountains, in the deep places where the roots of the world anchor the sky. But they can be called, if the need is great, enough and the sacrifice willing. Ayana stared at the crystal with a mixture of awe and horror. "Grandmother, such beings have not walked the earth for generations beyond counting. To wake them now is the only way to protect the child of prophecy until he can grow into his full power," Sacagawea Winona finished firmly. "The enemies who come against us represent forces of division and hatred that have poisoned the hearts of both red and white peoples. Only powers older than human prejudice can stand against them." The old woman turned the crystal in her hands, and Lydia could swear she saw faces moving in its depths, ancient, inhuman faces that regarded the modern world with emotions too alien to interpret. "But the choice must be freely made," Sacagawea Winona continued. "The crystal will accept no unwilling sacrifice. Someone must volunteer to serve as the bridge between the human world and the realm of the ancient guardians. Someone must offer their life to save not just the child, but the future he represents." Silence filled the dwelling as the implications of her words sank in. Lydia looked down at William, who was watching the crystal with those impossibly aware eyes, making soft sounds that seemed almost like attempts at communication with whatever lived within the crystalline depths. "There has to be another way," she said finally. "Some way to protect him without ... double quotes." She couldn't finish the sentence. "Perhaps," Sacagawea Winona acknowledged. "But time grows short, and our enemies are many. We must prepare for the possibility that desperate measures will be required." The older warrior had been listening to something outside that the others couldn't hear. Now he turned from the window with urgency written across his scarred features. "Grandmother, the wind brings news. Riders approach from the south, many riders, moving fast." Ayana was already reaching for his weapons. "How many?" "Too many," came the grim reply. "And they ride under the banner of the territorial army." Sacagawea Winona rose with fluid grace despite her age, the crystal disappearing back into her pouch. "It begins sooner than expected. Jennings grows impatient, or perhaps Bear Claw's shamans have been more successful than we hoped in pinpointing our location." She looked around the dwelling that had served as sanctuary for so many weeks, her expression sad but determined. "This place has served its purpose, but it cannot protect us from what comes next. We must leave, and we must leave now." Lydia felt panic rising in her chest. "Leave? But where can we go?" "If we're surrounded, we go to the high places," Sacagawea Winona said firmly. "To the sacred valley where the crystal's power runs strongest, where the ancient guardians sleep closest to the surface of the world. If we must make our stand, better to do it where the old powers can aid us." She moved toward the door with purpose that brooked no argument. "Gather only what you must have to survive. The enemy will be here within the hour, and our path to safety grows narrower with each passing moment." As Lydia hurriedly packed William's few belongings and checked her weapons, she felt the weight of destiny settling around them like a shroud. The peaceful weeks of training and preparation were over. The storm that had been building since the night of their rescue was finally about to break in all its terrible fury. Outside, the ravens took flight in a black cloud that darkened the morning sky, their harsh cries echoing across the valley like harbingers of the war to come. And from the south, faint but growing stronger, came the sound that would haunt Lydia's nightmares for years to come, the thunder of cavalry horses carrying death toward everything she held dear. The child of prophecy was about to face his first real test, and the future of two worlds hung in the balance. The ascent to the sacred valley was a nightmare of ice, altitude, and barely controlled terror. Sacagawea Winona led them up paths that seemed to exist more in memory than reality, narrow ledges carved from living rock, hidden switchbacks that required them to dismount and lead their horses through passages barely wide enough for their bodies, treacherous climbs where a single misstep would send them tumbling into abysses that disappeared into darkness below. The old woman moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had traveled these routes for decades. But for Lydia, every step was an exercise in faith and desperation. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew steadily closer. The territorial cavalry had reached Ayana's dwelling within an hour of their departure, just as Sacagawea Winona had predicted. Now 3 hours into their climb, they could hear the echo of gunshots bouncing off the canyon walls as soldiers attempted to follow their trail. Colonel Jennings had brought bloodhounds. Lydia could hear their baying carried on the thin mountain air, a sound that sent primal chills down her spine. But it was the other pursuit that truly terrified her. Bear Claw's Lakota warriors moved through the high country like ghosts, leaving no tracks and making no sound. The only evidence of their presence was the occasional glimpse of painted figures moving across distant ridges, always keeping pace, always watching, always waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "They're hurting us," Ayana said grimly as they paused to rest on a narrow ledge that offered a view back down the mountainside. "Bear Claw knows where we're going. He's forcing us to take this path because it serves his purposes." Sacagawea Winona nodded, unsurprised by this tactical reality. Of course he knows. The Sacred Valley has been known to Lakota shamans for as long as it has been known to ours. He understands that we seek to reach the place where the heart of the mountain can be activated, but he also believes he can prevent us from completing the ritual. She adjusted the leather sling that held William against her chest. The old woman had insisted on carrying the baby during the most treacherous parts of the climb, claiming that her spiritual connection to the child would protect them both from falling. Remarkably, this seemed to be true. Despite the perilous conditions, William remained calm and alert, his eyes fixed on the towering peaks above them, as if he could see something there that was invisible to adult perception. "How much farther?" Lydia asked, her lungs burning from the thin air and constant exertion. "We are closer than you might think," Sacagawea Winona replied cryptically. "But distance in the sacred places is not measured as it is in the ordinary world. We must pass through 3 barriers before we reach our destination, barriers that exist as much in spirit as in flesh." As if summoned by her words, the first barrier revealed itself as they rounded a massive boulder that had blocked their view. Ahead, the path simply ended, disappearing into a chasm that stretched across their route like an open wound in the mountain. The gap was perhaps 15 feet wide, with walls that dropped away into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. On the far side, the trail continued, but there was no visible way to cross. The 2 Shoshone warriors who had accompanied Sacagawea Winona began unpacking climbing ropes and metal spikes, preparing to attempt a crossing that looked suicidal even to Lydia's inexperienced eyes. But the old woman stopped them with a gesture. "No," she said firmly. "This barrier cannot be crossed by physical means alone. It is a test of faith, a challenge that exists primarily in the realm of spirit." She approached the edge of the chasm, and began to chant in the old language, her voice echoing strangely in the thin air. As she sang, something remarkable happened. The darkness at the bottom of the gap began to change, revealing not empty space but a bridge of crystalline light that spanned the distance between the two sides. "The bridge exists," Sacagawea Winona explained, "but only for those who carry the blessing of the ancient powers. William's presence opens the way, but faith must sustain us as we cross." Lydia stared at the bridge of light, trying to convince herself that it was solid enough to support their weight. The logical part of her mind insisted that she was hallucinating from altitude and stress, but another part, the part that had learned to see with more than physical eyes, recognized the bridge as absolutely real. "I'll go first," Ayanna said, stepping forward with the grim determination of someone accepting a potentially fatal risk. "No," Sacagawea Winona stopped him again. "The mother must lead. The bridge responds to the bond between William and his protector. She is the key that opens the way for all of us." Lydia felt her knees go weak. The thought of stepping out onto a bridge made of light, 15 feet above what looked like an infinite drop, with her baby's life depending on her faith, was almost paralyzing. But as she looked into William's eyes, she saw something there that steadied her resolve. Trust, absolute, unquestioning trust that she would not let him fall. Taking a deep breath, Lydia stepped onto the bridge. The surface felt solid beneath her feet, though it continued to look like nothing more than crystallized light. Each step sent ripples of color racing ahead of her, and she could feel power thrumming through the strange material like a heartbeat. Behind her, she heard the others following, their footsteps creating harmonies in the crystal that sounded almost like music. They were halfway across when the attack came. Bear Claw's warriors had been waiting for this moment when their quarry was trapped on the bridge with nowhere to run. War cries echoed off the canyon walls as painted figures appeared on both sides of the chasm, arrows already nocked and aimed. But these weren't ordinary arrows. Each one glowed with the same dark energy Lydia had seen in her dreams, their points blazing with spiritual fire meant to wound souls as well as flesh. "Down!" Ayanna shouted, but there was nowhere to take cover on the narrow bridge. That's when William did something that changed everything. The baby opened his mouth and sang. It wasn't crying or the random sounds that normal infants make. It was actual music, complex, haunting, impossibly beautiful. The song rose from his tiny throat with a power that seemed to fill the entire canyon, and as it did, the crystalline bridge responded. Light exploded outward from where they stood, racing along the bridge in both directions until it formed a song that formed a fond dome of pure energy that surrounded them completely. The Lakota arrows struck the dome and simply vanished, absorbed into the protective barrier without leaving so much as a mark. But the song did more than just protect them. As William's voice rose higher, the very mountains began to respond. Deep beneath their feet, something stirred, something vast and ancient that had been sleeping for millennia. The earth trembled, not with the violence of an earthquake, but with the slow, purposeful movement of a giant awakening. "The guardians," Sacagawea Winona whispered in awe. "The child calls to them directly. I have never seen such power in one so young." The protective dome around them began to expand, pushing outward until it encompassed the entire canyon. Where its light touched the Lakota warriors, they didn't die, they simply froze in place, held motionless by forces beyond their comprehension. On the mountainsides above, the sound of the pursuing cavalry grew distant and confused as soldiers found themselves unable to approach the source of the supernatural light. "Move," Sacagawea Winona commanded. "The child has bought us time, but such power cannot be sustained for long in one so young. We must reach the sacred valley before his strength fails." They ran across the remainder of the bridge, William's song still echoing around them as they reached the far side. But as soon as they stepped onto solid ground, the baby's voice faltered and fell silent. The dome of light flickered and began to fade, and in the distance, they could hear their enemies beginning to move again. The second barrier appeared within minutes of leaving the bridge, behind a wall of ice that stretched across their path, like a frozen waterfall. But this ice was different from anything natural. It was black as midnight and so cold that frost formed on their clothing just from approaching it. Worse, shapes moved within the ice-twisted figures that might once have been human, but had been transformed into something nightmarish. The ice of ancient sorrows, Sacagawea Winona said grimly. It forms wherever great spiritual evil has taken place. This wall remembers every act of hatred committed in these mountains, every murder motivated by prejudice, every child killed because of the color of their skin. She drew out the heart of the mountain crystal, and immediately the shapes in the ice began moving more frantically, pressing against the barrier as if trying to escape. We cannot go around this obstacle. We must pass through it, and to do so, we must face the darkness that created it. What does that mean? Lydia asked, though she feared she already knew. It means we must confront the worst aspects of ourselves, the hatred and fear that live in every human heart. The ice will show us visions of what we might become if we surrender to those darker impulses. Sacagawea Winona looked at each of them in turn. Some who enter this ice never emerge. They become lost in visions of their own potential for evil and forget that they ever chose a different path. Ayana stepped forward first, his hand resting on his knife hilt. I will lead. No, the old woman said once more. The mother must still go first. She's the one the ice most wants to claim. If she can pass through, the rest of us can follow in her wake. Lydia stared at the wall of black ice, watching the tormented figures writhing within its depths. She could already feel something cold and hostile reaching out to her, whispering seductive thoughts about how much easier life would be if she simply accepted that some people were meant to be enemies, that some differences could never be bridged. But then William stirred in her arms, and she felt the warmth of his small body against her chest. Whatever darkness lived in that ice, it was nothing compared to the love she felt for her son. That love was her anchor, her protection against any corruption the barrier might try to inflict. She stepped into the ice. The cold was indescribable, not just physical but spiritual, a chill that tried to freeze the very soul. Around her, visions began to form. She saw herself as she might have been, a bitter, hate-filled woman who blamed the natives for her husband's death, who raised William to despise his mixed heritage, who spent her life spreading the poison of racial hatred. She saw futures where she collaborated with men like Colonel Jennings, where she testified against innocent natives, where she became everything evil that the frontier could produce. But through it all, William's presence kept her anchored to who she really was. The baby didn't cry or fuss as they passed through the ice. Instead, he seemed to radiate warmth that held the visions at bay, his very existence a reminder that love was stronger than hate, that hope was more powerful than fear. When they emerged on the far side, Lydia felt as if she had been reborn. The others followed quickly, each bearing the haunted expression of someone who had seen their worst possible selves and chosen to reject that darkness. The third barrier was the strangest of all, a simple wooden door standing alone in the middle of the trail, with no walls or structure around it. The door was carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when observed directly, and from beyond it came a sound like wind through infinite spaces. The door of choosing, Sacagawea Winona announced. Beyond this threshold lies the sacred valley, but also a choice that cannot be undone. Once we pass through, we commit ourselves to the final confrontation. There will be no retreat, no alternative paths. We will either awaken the guardians and save the child of prophecy, or we will die in the attempt. She looked at Lydia with eyes that held the weight of centuries. The choice must be unanimous. If any one of us has doubts, if anyone wishes to Turn back and seek another way. Speak now. Once that door opens, our fates are sealed." Lydia looked at her companions, Ayanna, who had saved them from the blizzard and taught her to survive. Sacagawea Winona, who carried knowledge that could reshape the world. The two warriors who had risked everything to protect strangers. All of them had sacrificed safety and comfort to defend a child they barely knew, all because they believed in a prophecy that promised hope in a world consumed by hatred. "I choose to go forward," she said firmly, "whatever the cost." One by one, the others voiced their agreement. When the last word was spoken, the door swung open silently, revealing a valley that took Lydia's breath away. It was impossibly beautiful, a hidden sanctuary surrounded by peaks that seemed to scrape the sky itself. Crystalline streams wound through meadows of grass, so green it seemed to glow with inner light, and flowers bloomed in colors that had no names. But it was the presence she felt that truly amazed her, a sense of ancient wisdom and power that made every blade of grass, every stone, every breath of air seem sacred. At the center of the valley stood a circle of standing stones, each one carved with symbols that matched those in Ayanna's hidden chamber. And between the stones, the air itself seemed to shimmer with possibilities. "Welcome," Sacagawea Winona said as they stepped through the door, "to the place where the world began. Here, if anywhere, the child of prophecy can claim his birthright and change the destiny of all peoples." But even as she spoke, new sounds echoed from the peaks around them. War cries from the north, bugle calls from the south. Their enemies had found them at last, and the final battle was about to begin. In her arms, William opened his eyes and looked directly at the circle of stones. For the first time since his birth, he smiled with full awareness, as if he finally understood why he had been born and what he was meant to do. The awakening had begun. The sacred valley had become a battlefield of destiny, where the ancient stones bore witness to a conflict that would determine the future of two worlds. From the northern peaks, Bear Claw's 60 Lakota warriors descended like a living avalanche of war paint and steel. Their battle cries echoed off the crystalline cliffs as they rode their painted ponies down slopes that should have been impassable, guided by shamanic power that bent the very laws of nature to their will. At their head rode Bear Claw himself, his massive frame draped in the hide of the great bear that had given him his name, his face painted with symbols that seemed to writhe and move in the morning light. From the south came the thunder of Cavalry Colonel Jennings and nearly 200 territorial soldiers, their blue uniforms stark against the pristine landscape of the hidden valley. Artillery pieces had been somehow hauled up the mountain passes, their bronze barrels gleaming like instruments of mechanized doom. The colonel rode at the front of his force, his face set in the grim lines of a man who believed he was saving civilization itself by destroying what he saw as an abomination against the natural order. And in the center of the valley, beside the ancient circle of standing stones, stood 5 people and 1 baby, who represented the last hope for a world that had forgotten how to choose love over fear. A Cagawea-Winona moved with ritual precision as she prepared the heart of the mountain for activation. The crystal had been placed at the exact center of the stone circle, where lines of power that had been ancient when the first humans walked. The earth converged in patterns, too complex for modern minds to comprehend. Around the crystal, she arranged objects that had been gathering power for generations, eagle feathers that had witnessed the flight of spirits, stones carved with symbols from the time before memory, bones of animals that had given their lives willingly for the sacred work. "The ritual requires a life freely given," she explained as she worked, her voice calm despite the approaching armies. "Not death, but life. Someone must serve as the bridge between the world of flesh and the realm of the guardians. They will live, but they will be forever changed, forever bound to the ancient powers that sleep beneath these mountains." Lydia watched the old woman's preparations with a mixture of awe and terror. Around them, Ayanna and the 2 Shoshone warriors, had taken defensive positions among the standing stones, their weapons ready but pitifully inadequate against the forces converging on their location. The mathematics of the situation were brutal: 5 adults against more than 250 enemies, with nowhere to run and no hope of conventional victory. But this was not a conventional battle. As the first arrows began to arc across the valley from Bear Claw's advancing warriors, William did something that defied every law of nature and reason. The 3-month-old baby, still cradled in his mother's arms, reached out one tiny hand toward the heart of the mountain and spoke a single word in the ancient tongue, a word that had not been heard on earth for 1,000 years. The crystal responded instantly, erupting in light so brilliant that it seemed to capture and focus the very essence of the sun itself. But this was not the harsh, blinding glare of ordinary illumination. This was the light of creation, the same radiance that had sparked the first dawn when the world was young and all things were possible. The light spread outward from the crystal in waves that passed harmlessly through the defenders but struck their enemies like a physical force. Lakota warriors found their horses refusing to advance, the animals whinnying in terror and backing away from the expanding dome of radiance. Cavalry soldiers raised hands to shield their eyes, their disciplined formations beginning to waver as men and horses alike reacted to energies that spoke to the deepest, most primal parts of their consciousness. Now, Sacagawea Winona commanded, while the guardians stir. Someone must complete the bond. Without hesitation, Ayana stepped forward toward the crystal. I will be the bridge. I have lived long enough to see the prophecy born. Let my life serve its fulfillment. But before he could reach the heart of the mountain, another figure burst from the tree line at the eastern edge of the valley. Joseph Crowfeather arrived like a force of nature himself, his horse lathered with sweat and foam, his clothing torn from desperate flight through mountain passes. Behind him rode 20 Shoshone warriors, all that remained of the larger force that had attempted to reach the sacred valley in time. "My son!" Joseph shouted as he leaped from his horse and ran toward the stone circle. I felt his call across the mountains. "The blood of my blood cries out." His eyes found Lydia across the battlefield, and in that moment of recognition, something passed between them that transcended the chaos of war. Love, loss, hope, and determination, all the complex emotions of two people who had created life together and now faced the possibility of watching that life become something greater and more terrible than either had imagined. But there was no time for reunion or explanation. Bear Claw's shamans had begun their own ritual, dark magic designed to counter the awakening power of the crystal. Shadow figures rose from the earth around the Lakota war party, spirits of ancient battles, ghosts of warriors who had died with hatred in their hearts, wraiths that fed on conflict and bloodshed. These spectral fighters charged ahead of the living warriors, immune to normal weapons and driven by supernatural malice. At the same moment, Colonel Jennings gave the order for his artillery to open fire. The first cannonball screamed across the valley and struck one of the standing stones, shattering the ancient monolith in an explosion of rock and crystal dust. The destruction of the stone sent visible ripples of pain through the light emanating from the heart of the mountain, and Sacagawea Winona cried out as if she had been physically wounded. "The circle is breaking," she gasped. "If they destroy the stones, the ritual cannot be completed. The guardians will return to their eternal sleep." That's when Lydia made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Stepping forward with William still in her arms, she placed her free hand on the heart of the mountain and spoke with a voice that carried across the entire valley. "I offer myself as the bridge, not because I am brave, but because I am a mother, because some things are worth any sacrifice, because my son deserves a world where love is stronger than hate." The crystal's response was immediate and overwhelming. Power flowed through Lydia like liquid lightning, transforming her in ways that went far beyond the merely physical. Her consciousness expanded until she could perceive the valley from impossible perspectives, from the viewpoint of soaring eagles, from the awareness of ancient trees, from the patient wisdom of stones that had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations. And through that expanded awareness, she called to the guardians. They answered. The earth itself began to move, not with the violence of an earthquake, but with the purposeful motion of living things awakening from deep sleep. Massive forms stirred beneath the valley floor, beings of stone and crystal and elemental fire that had slumbered since the world was young. One by one, they rose from their resting places, taking shapes that were beautiful and terrible beyond human comprehension. The first guardian to emerge was a creature of living crystal, its faceted body refracting the light from the heart of the mountain into rainbow patterns that painted the entire valley in shifting colors. It stood 30 feet tall, its movements creating music that resonated through stone and bone alike. When it turned its attention to Bear Claw's spectral warriors, the ghost fighters simply dissolved, unable to maintain their existence in the presence of such primal purity. The second guardian was a being of wind and storm, its form constantly shifting between solid matter and pure energy. It swept across the valley like a localized hurricane, but one that touched only the weapons of the attacking forces. Rifles were torn from soldiers' hands, arrows scattered like leaves in autumn, and the artillery pieces were lifted bodily from their positions and hurled into distant canyons. The third guardian was perhaps the most awesome, a creature of living fire that rose from the earth like a pillar of controlled flame. But this was not destructive fire. It was the flame of purification, of transformation, of the forge where souls are reborn. As it moved among the attackers, those it touched were not burned but changed. Their hatred and fear transformed into understanding, their desire for violence replaced by a deep, overwhelming awareness of the connections that bound all living things together. Bear Claw himself rode directly at this guardian, his war lance aimed at what he perceived as the creature's heart. But when the point of his weapon touched the being of flame, both lance and warrior were enveloped in transformative fire. When the flames receded, Bear Claw remained, but he was no longer the same man. The terrible scars that had marked his face were gone, replaced by expressions of wonder and dawning comprehension. He looked around the battlefield as if seeing it for the first time, his eyes wide with the realization of what his hatred had almost cost the world. Colonel Jennings proved more resistant to transformation. When the Guardian of Crystal approached his position, he drew his saber and attempted to rally his men for a final charge. "Stand fast," he shouted. "These are demons, illusions sent to confuse us. The mongrel child must die, no matter what unholy powers protect it." But his soldiers were no longer listening. One by one, they laid down their weapons, overcome by the presence of beings that represented forces older and wiser than any human conflict. Some wept openly, finally understanding the magnitude of what they had been asked to do. Others simply stood in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process the reality of powers that transcended every assumption they had ever made about the nature of existence. In the end, only Jennings himself remained defiant, his hatred so deep and corrosive that even the Guardian's transformative power could not immediately penetrate it. He raised his pistol toward where Lydia stood with William, his face twisted with the kind of fanatical rage that had driven men to commit atrocities throughout history. That's when Joseph Crowfeather acted. William's father had been moving steadily closer to the stone circle throughout the battle, his warrior's instincts guiding him toward the greatest threat to his family. Now as Jennings took aim at his son, Joseph threw himself between the colonel and his targets. The pistol fired, the bullet taking Joseph in the chest and spinning him around. But even as he fell, he managed to tackle Jennings, carrying both of them to the ground in a tangle of limbs and weapons. The sight of his father falling broke something loose in William that had been building since his birth. The baby opened his mouth and released a sound that was part cry, part song, part something beyond human understanding. The voice of the child of prophecy rang across the sacred valley with power that made the guardians themselves pause in wonder. And, in response to that voice, the heart of the mountain erupted in a pillar of light that reached from the earth to the sky itself. The light was visible for hundreds of miles, a beacon that called to every person, white or native, who carried even a spark of hope for a better world. In settlements across the territory, people stopped what they were doing and looked toward the mountains, feeling something fundamental shift in the very fabric of reality. Children laughed without knowing why. Adults found themselves embracing. Enemies, warriors on both sides of countless conflicts, suddenly remembered what they had been fighting to protect, rather than what they had been fighting against. Within the valley itself, the transformation was complete. Where moments before had stood armies bent on destruction, now gathered men and women who looked at each other with new eyes. Bear Claw approached the stone circle slowly, his massive frame no longer radiating menace, but carrying instead the dignified bearing of a leader who had finally found wisdom. Behind him, his warriors followed, their weapons abandoned, their faces marked with the same dawning understanding that had transformed their chief. From the other side of the valley, the surviving soldiers approached with equal care. They had helped their wounded colonel to his feet, though Jennings himself seemed dazed and uncertain, as if waking from a terrible dream. The hatred that had driven him was gone, replaced by a hollow confusion that would take time to fill with something better. At the center of it all, Lydia still stood connected to the heart of the mountain, her body suffused with crystalline light, her consciousness expanded far beyond its normal limits. She was still recognizably herself, but she was also something more, a living bridge between the human world and the realm of the Guardians. Forever changed by the role she had chosen to play, Joseph Crow Feather lay dying in Ayana's arms, his chest rising and falling with increasing difficulty as blood soaked through his shirt. But his eyes were clear and focused on his son, and when he spoke, his voice carried the peaceful certainty of a man who had fulfilled his purpose. "He will be greater than either of us dreamed," he whispered to Lydia. "The child of two worlds. The bridge builder, the one who makes all things possible. Love him as both his peoples will love him, and teach him that strength comes not from purity, but from the courage to embrace what is different." As Joseph's eyes closed for the final time, William reached out from his mother's arms toward his father's still form. And where the baby's tiny hand touched the dying man's forehead, new light bloomed, not the brilliant radiance of the Guardians, but something gentler and more personal. Joseph's wounds healed before their eyes, his breathing strengthened, and when he opened his eyes again, they held the same supernatural awareness that now marked his son. "The prophecy is fulfilled," Sacagawea Winona announced, her ancient voice carrying across the transformed valley. "The child of two worlds has claimed his birthright, not through violence, but through love. The Guardians have awakened, not to destroy but to protect. And the bridge between peoples has been built, not with stone and steel but with sacrifice and understanding." She looked around at the gathered crowd, Lakota and cavalry, Shoshone and settlers, enemies who had become something closer to family through their shared witness to miracle. "From this day forward, this valley will be sacred to all peoples. Here, differences will be celebrated rather than feared. Here, children of every heritage will learn the old ways and the new, the wisdom of all cultures flowing together like streams joining a great river. And here, the child of prophecy will grow to manhood, protected by guardians both human and divine, preparing for the greater work that still lies ahead." Years later, when storytellers gathered around fires in settlements across the territory, they would speak of the day when the mountains themselves awakened to prevent a war. They would tell of a baby whose first real words called forth beings of legend, of a mother who sacrificed her ordinary life to become something extraordinary, of enemies who became friends through witnessing powers greater than their own hatred. But in the sacred valley, as the sun set on a day that had changed the world forever, Lydia simply held her son and marveled at the peace that had settled over them all. William slept in her arms, his tiny face serene, his breathing steady and strong. Around them, former enemies worked together to tend the wounded and share the evening meal, their voices mingling in conversation that would have been impossible just hours before. The child of prophecy had been born, the guardians had awakened, and the first step toward a world where love conquered hatred had been taken. There would be challenges ahead, there always were, but for the first time since the story began. The future looked bright with possibility, rather than dark with despair, in the gathering dusk. The heart of the mountain pulsed gently with warmth and light, an eternal reminder that some things are indeed worth any sacrifice, and that the greatest magic of all is the courage to choose hope over fear, love over hatred, unity over division. Sacred covenant had been sealed, and the world would never be the same.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.